Moses and Pharaoh. The story. After speaking with the elders, Moses and Aaron went to see Pharaoh, demanding he allow them and the Israelites to leave Egypt and hold a feast to God. Pharaoh harshly refused, claiming not to know their God. Aaron then spoke the words God commanded to Moses through the bush, requesting he permit he, Moses, and the Israelites to travel 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to God, adding he might hurt them if they do not. Like God said, Pharaoh refused. After the two left Pharaoh, the foremen of the Israelites approached them and rebuked Aaron and Moses for speaking with Pharaoh, because it caused their conditions to worsen. Moses returned to God and confided in him, asking why these things had occurred. God answered Moses, confirming, like in Horeb, that Pharaoh would free them, and repeated his promise to give them the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hittites, and Jebusites land. Moses recalled this conversation to the Israelites, who didn't believe him. God spoke to Moses again and commissioned him and his brother Aaron to confront Pharaoh and free the Israelites. Moses and Aaron went to see Pharaoh for a second time. This time God added that he wanted Aaron to perform the staff to serpent sign, which he showed Moses in Horeb. Pharaoh wasn't impressed. He assembled Egypt's sorcerers, magicians, and wise men, who did the same, using their secret arts, not God. To try and convince Pharaoh, God directed Aaron's serpent to consume the other reptiles, yet it did nothing. God commanded Moses and Aaron to visit Pharaoh for a third time. This time he required the brothers perform the water to blood sign. He also instructed at Horeb. However, instead of just a small amount, God called him to touch the spot in the Nile where he would meet Pharaoh, turning the whole river into blood, killing the fish and contaminating the water so the Egyptians couldn't drink it. God also commanded Aaron to do the same, but with all the water sources in Egypt. Pharaoh wasn't convinced, and the Egyptian wizards performed the same wonder. God called Aaron and Moses to confront Pharaoh for a fourth time. However, this time God promised to show Pharaoh a sign not promised when he first spoke with Moses. This miracle consisted of God filling the land of Egypt with frogs on Aaron's command. As the frogs swarmed across the land, Pharaoh appeared to submit, even though the Egyptian wizards proved they could achieve the frog sign with their ways, and agreed to let the Israelites leave, and Moses asked God to remove the frogs. God did as Moses asked, with the frogs only remaining in the Nile, but he left their remains, and a foul smell stained the land of Egypt. Nevertheless, Pharaoh's submission was a ruse, and he retracted his approval for the Israelites to leave. After this fourth sign, God didn't command Moses and Aaron to see Pharaoh. He instead instructed Aaron through Moses to infest all Egypt with giant gnats, lice. Yet unlike the signs before, the Egyptians couldn't replicate it, and confirmed this was the work of God, but Pharaoh still wouldn't submit as God said. Following the gnats, God requested Moses and Aaron visit Pharaoh for a fifth time, and threatened to fill all of Egypt except for Goshen, where the Israelites were living. Goshen is the place where Jacob and family settled on Joseph's request, with flies if he wouldn't let them go. Following the release of the flies into Egypt, Pharaoh bargained with Moses and Aaron, suggesting they conduct their sacrifices to God within the borders of Egypt, instead of traveling 3 days into the wilderness. Moses and Aaron rejected this offer, saying it might offend the Egyptians, and they may put the two and their people to death because of it. Pharaoh offered the two another suggestion. He had let them leave and sacrifice, but only a little bit outside of Egypt. Moses spoke to God about this, and he agreed, removing all the flies from Egypt. Yet again Pharaoh lied and didn't allow the Israelites to leave. For the sixth time, God ordered Moses and Aaron to confront Pharaoh. He informed them if Pharaoh doesn't allow his people to leave, he would kill all the Egyptians' livestock, but wouldn't touch the Israelites at all. Pharaoh did not, and God followed through with his promise. For the seventh time the brothers visited Pharaoh. God commanded Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from the kiln's oven, and throw their handfuls into the sky in front of Pharaoh, after which boils would appear on all the Egyptians and their livestock. This became known as the plague of boils. The wizards of Egypt couldn't replicate the boils since they were infected, and Pharaoh refused to submit again. For the eighth, God promised to send the plague of hail if Pharaoh didn't heed to his demands, which he did not. God instructed Moses to stretch his hands out and up towards the sky, and God rained down thunder, heavy hail, and fire across the whole of Egypt. killing people, livestock, and plants. The only part not affected was again Goshen, where the Israelites were settled. Pharaoh repented and consented to the brothers' demands, yet after God ended the storm, Pharaoh reversed his decision. God sent Moses and Aaron to speak with Pharaoh for the 9th and final time, promising to bring swarms of locusts if he didn't comply with God's demands, which Pharaoh didn't. The locusts destroyed what was left of Egypt after the hailstorm. Pharaoh submitted like times before, and God withdrew the locusts. Nevertheless, as he had done before, Pharaoh overturned his rule. After the locusts, God called Moses to stretch his hands to the sky, and when he did, God brought a thick darkness over the land of Egypt for 3 days, but not for the Israelites. This time Pharaoh called for Moses and offered to let him and the Israelites leave and sacrifice to God. Moses agreed, but required he give them the animals for said sacrifices. However, after this request, Pharaoh reverted his offer and stated he never wanted to see Moses again, a demand Moses was happy to accept, marking the 10th and final time Moses and Pharaoh would speak. After the darkness had passed, God gave Pharaoh one last chance to change his mind and allow the Israelites to leave Egypt. He informed Moses of his plan to kill all the firstborn males of Egypt, both human and animal, at midnight that day, in response to Pharaoh's decree to murder the firstborn male Israelites from years back. However, God had no intention to kill any Israelite children, so told Moses that he, Aaron, and the rest of the Israelites would slaughter a 1-year-old male lamb and drain its blood into a basin. They would then paint the blood mixed with hyssop on the sides and top of both door frames in their homes, and not leave until the next morning. The Israelites did as Moses commanded, and God passed over the houses with the blood, and not the ones without. No Israelites died, but all the Egyptian firstborns did, including Pharaoh's. After this act of God, Pharaoh demanded the Israelites leave Egypt, this time not relenting on his word. The Israelites left Egypt, taking the Egyptians' valuable goods with them, as God promised to Moses at the burning bush. Besides children, 600,000 men left at this point, after living in Egypt for 430 years. At some point after Moses and the Israelites had left Egypt, God confirmed to Moses that Pharaoh would soon change his mind about letting them go, and would pursue after them. He also told him to lead the Israelites to the sea and camp by it. Pharaoh did exactly as God said, assembling his chariots, horsemen, and army, chasing after and overtaking them at their camp by the sea. The Israelites were scared when they saw the Egyptians approaching. They angrily condemned Moses for bringing them into the wilderness to die, and not letting them remain in Egypt. Moses reassured his fellow Israelites that God would protect and save them from this threat. God commanded Moses to lift his arms while holding his staff in one hand and spread them both simultaneously. When he did, the sea split in two, and Moses and the Israelites walked on the dry sea floor, with the ocean acting as walls on either side. Pharaoh and the Egyptians followed, but when they started homing in on the Israelites, God made their pursuit difficult, and after a while they decided to retreat and return home. While the Egyptians and Pharaoh were retreating, the Israelites had crossed the sea and were on the seashore. God instructed Moses to repeat the process from before, but instead of spreading his arms, brought them together, causing the sea waters to close. God saved Moses and the Israelites and defeated their enemies, the Egyptians and Pharaoh. Now Moses and the Israelites could continue their journey to the land God promised them. Digging deeper. We'll begin this section by comparing the 10 plagues God unleashed on Egypt with both rounds of 7 wonders recorded in the book of Revelation, the Trumpets and Bowls. The 10 plagues in Egypt are water to blood, the frogs, the lice, the flies, the livestock pestilence, the boils, the hail, the locusts, the 3 days of darkness, and the killing of firstborn Egyptian children, recorded in Exodus 7-11. The 7 trumpets from Revelation are hail and fire mixed with blood, a third of the sea turning into blood, a third of fresh water sources becoming infected with wormwood, a third of the day becoming darkness, 5 months of torment from symbolic locusts, and a third of humanity killed by a 200 million person army. The 7th isn't a plague, but is part of the trumpets and is the return of Jesus, recorded in Revelation 8-9 and 11-15. The 7 bowls from Revelation are the the loathsome sores, the seas of blood, the river of blood, the scorching sun, darkness, war, Armageddon, and God's fury, the day of the Lord, recorded in Revelation 16. As you probably recognize, some of the plagues from Exodus, the trumpets and the bowls, overlap. The first is blood to water, the first Egyptian, the second trumpet, and the second and third bowl. The second is darkness, the ninth plague, the fourth trumpet, and the fifth bowl. The seventh plague and first trumpet involve hail. The sixth plague and first bowl involve a skin disease. Finally, the eighth plague and fifth trumpet are about locusts. There's a clear connection between the Exodus plagues and the trumpets and bowls from Revelation, and I believe that's intentional. I see the plagues as the predecessor to what's to come, and a warning to stay faithful to God. To finish this section, we'll explore the feast of the Passover. The Passover festival is the feast God commanded the Jewish people through Moses to begin at sunset on the 15th of Nisan, anywhere between March 26 and April 25, and last till nightfall on the 21st of Nisan, or 7 days after the start date, every year till the end of time. This feast is to celebrate and remember God's grace, salvation and protection from the 10th and final plague God inflicted on the Egyptians, killing the firstborn human and animal children, but none of the Israelites, passing over their houses, hence the name Passover. The details for the Passover feast are recorded in Exodus 12 verse 3 to 11 and verses 43 to 49. God says the Passover lamb is to be cooked with fire and eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. All the animal must be eaten on the night it's cooked, to be eaten with the loins girded, sandals on feet, staff in hand, and eaten quickly. God also states that only those circumcised can partake, and anyone who isn't has to become so. It is also the feast Jesus and the 12 disciples were enjoying in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and John 13. This particular feast has become known as the Lord's Supper. Another festival connected to the Passover feast is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This festival happens during the Passover week, and the Israelites do not eat or have any contact with leaven during this time. Physically, leaven is a substance that helps dough rise, similar to yeast or baking powder. Spiritually, leaven represents wickedness and sin, as seen in Matthew 16:6, Mark 8:14 to 15, and Luke 12:1 to 3, when Jesus refers to the Pharisees' teachings as leaven of the Pharisees, but also positively representing the growth of God's kingdom, as seen in the parable of the leaven from Matthew 13:33 and Luke 13:20 to 21. I believe in the context of the festival it refers to wickedness and sin, because the Passover remembers God's salvation, and since the two festivals happen together, it's possible the removal of leaven symbolizes God removing evil from Israel. What to learn? What should we take away from the story of Moses and Pharaoh from Exodus 5 to 14? I believe it teaches us the importance of not hardening our hearts to God, but softening them and allowing God to have his way within us. God gave Pharaoh many chances, 10 to be exact, to soften his heart and let the Israelites leave Egypt and sacrifice to God in the wilderness. Despite the text saying that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, seemingly making these chances futile, however, I believe we are meant to view Pharaoh as an example of what could happen if Christians don't allow God to live within us. On the contrary, Moses is an example of what softening our hearts and allowing God control over our lives looks like. During each chance God gives to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, Moses and his brother Aaron willingly and happily comply and complete each and every task God gives them, helping God fulfill his purpose. How does this apply to us today? As stated, Pharaoh is an example of a hardened heart and Moses an example of a softened heart. We too receive opportunities from God, and we can choose to soften or harden our hearts in response. Despite our choice, God's plan will always prevail, yet the level of challenge we face on the journey may differ depending on which way we turn.